Our next guest is a social entrepreneur who has dedicated her life to promote Indigenous art and artists. Nadine St-Louis is a firm believer in the art's power to build bridges and to be a means of reconciliation. Welcome to this World Talk special. Nadine, welcome to this World Talk special.
Thank you for having me.
Let me start by asking you, what does economic reconciliation mean to you?
Reconciliation is reconnecting with the relationship you once had. So Indigenous people and the settler people established their relationship based on trade 450 years ago in the eastern part of Canada. So doing economic reconciliation is bringing back the original relationship that we've had with our economic participation in this landscape that we call Canada today.
I want to explore the role of arts in this economic reconciliation. What is the arts' contribution to economic or reconciliation in general?
Okay, that's a really loaded question. First of all, we have to understand that Canada is a colonial country with colonial laws, and we had a document for assimilating Indigenous people called the Indian Act that made all cultural practice illegal. From 1876 to 1951, all cultural practices were illegal. Dance, drumming, beading, making traditional clothing, ceremonies, language, anything that pertains to your identity of culture was banned. We call it the 75-year potlatch ban, where even gathering amongst nation to nation for an exchange in food and ceremonies and dance was illegal. Now think of that for half a second. For almost 100 years, you're not allowed to have anything that remotely looks Indigenous within your community. So if you have a pipe, a drum, when I say a pipe, there's peace pipes, and we have ceremonial drums, and we have even clothing, regalia. Regalia is a traditional wear, like that men and women would wear. It was all confiscated by the government, distributed across the museums in Europe and Canada, because the government didn't think that Indigenous people were capable of archiving their own stories, their own artifacts, their own legacies. So banning this is also stripping the people of who they are and what they are, and it's that connection to their past and their future. So that was made illegal. So reconciliation with the arts is about reclaiming that voice that was absent in Canada's history. See, Canada's history has a very narrow narrative. The voice was a very colonial voice, and Indigenous people didn't have a voice, a cultural voice, an artistic voice.
Can now art bring that voice back?
Oh, absolutely. I think reclaiming cultural identity is part of the healing. Reconciliation is making healing or connection with the past in history, in culture, and economies. If you look at the tourism industry, people that come to Canada want to experience an Indigenous experience of having an item that's Indigenous made. You can't find in 98% of all the stores, whether you're in Toronto, Montreal, Winnipeg, it is hard to find 100% Indigenous made items because Canada has been flooded by third world products that look Indigenous. Masks, moccasins, totems, made in Bangladesh, Pakistan, China.
Why is cultural appropriation something you feel so passionate about?
Okay, in order to understand, cultural appropriation is like pressing the emotional button that reminds every single Indigenous person in Canada that we come from a stolen history, stolen land, stolen identity, stolen rights, stolen voices, broken treaties. The whole history of Canada is based on appropriation of people and land. Cultural appropriation is a reminder that Indigenous voices are still not 100% controlled by Indigenous people, that the markets are still being flooded by items that are mass-produced by countries where people are producing totem poles, moccasins, masks, Indigenous items that were banned from Canada's history for Indigenous people for close to 100 years. So for 100 years, there was a whole other market that developed and is controlled by non-Indigenous people for an Indigenous economy. It is time, if we're going to speak about reconciliation, the time has come now to reclaim that economy. Cultural appropriation is a reminder that there is an economy out there and we're not in control of it.
Women are often carrier of culture. What has been the role of women in Aboriginal culture?
Well, I like to think of the movement that's happening now, I like to call it a matriarchal resurgence, where women are reclaiming the role of teacher and transferring knowledge from generation to generation, whether it's your auntie, your grandma, or your sister, or your cousin. Women have always passed on knowledge to each other because women are the teachers in our communities. We call it the mother tongue, right? Our mothers teach us language. So even within the language is culture. And with the banning of cultures in the arts, language was also banned. And children were also separated from that. So now reclaiming culture, reclaiming the know-how is also giving room to Indigenous women to take that space and salvage what was destroyed from the histories, to reclaim that space, to teach their children through the arts, from the land.
You have created something called Ashukan Cultural Space.
Yes, the Ashukan Cultural Space is a solution addressing the social problems faced by Indigenous communities. Poverty, isolation, marginalization. The Ashukan Cultural Space is addressing how do we build markets for remote communities? How do we do professional development for the artists that are isolated in their communities, that don't have access to mechanisms or cultural development for their careers? We empower artists. We work with the grandmothers, who are the traditional knowledge carriers that pass on that knowledge to the youth. We work on educating the public on historical understanding of cultural Indigenous people. When I say Indigenous peoples, because there's so many nations. I know a lot of people in Europe, they come and they visit the Ashukan Cultural Space and they say, well, we want to see authentic Indians. And it's like, first of all, we're not called Indians. We're Indigenous people, which is the umbrella for Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. And in Quebec alone, we have 11 nations. There's over 55 nations across Canada and over 640 communities. And there's distinct languages for every single group. So being Indigenous, whether you live in the Inuit territory, you live in the Mi'kmaq territory where I'm from, is a totally different experience, but the worldview is all the same. My business model with the Ashukan Cultural Space is based on the Indigenous worldview of inclusive. It's about accelerating social inclusion, right? How do we bring Indigenous people forefront? How do we create economic empowerment through the arts? And how do we create that next generation of cultural workers, building stronger economies for tomorrow?
How can that happen?
I travel 280,000 square kilometers. For those who don't know that distance, it's like traveling from Montreal to Santiago, Chile, and back. And as I traveled, I was doing this mapping for an institution called Canada Arts Council, which is a national body governing the arts. And because the absence of representation of Indigenous artists was very important, it was like completely absent in the cultural dialogue of Quebec and Canada. As I mapped the territory, I realized we have world-class talent, but we also had a third world in our first world. Indigenous artists make 30% less money than non-Indigenous artists. Indigenous communities are isolated, often remote, where they have third world conditions, where there's the creation of the object, and whether it's literature, whether it's paintings, whether it's carving, they create in the north, but the markets are in the south. So how do you create that bridge to address the polarity of the north and the markets in the south? How do you bring economic cohesion to a people that live below the poverty line, who no longer have a voice in mainstream art industries?
You've talked a bit about it already, but if you would tell me what obstacles, and in particular the economic obstacles that Indigenous artists face today.
Well, the lack of funding, the lack of infrastructures. The lack of infrastructures. It's like building a plane, putting $1 million in the construction of a plane, but what if you don't have a landing strip? What do you do with your plane? See, 75% of all our communities are north of the 50th parallel, right? So the creation is done in the north, but the markets are done in the south, but there's no infrastructure in place. The lack of understanding for the mechanisms of the art world, the lack of opportunities to be seen by buyers, to do solo exhibitions, the lack of resources available, human resources, and the lack of policies to ensure social inclusion. So you need, the policies are the written policies in the document. In order to be part of that monument, museums, institutions, and across the country, you need to be part of the document. So you need to be part of the policies. And we have systemic exclusion for a big part of our Canadian history. We need to be working with all sectors of economy. We need to be working with the government sector, with the private sector. I think it's a responsibility from all sectors of society. We have corporate social responsibility mandates where for-profit organizations build bridges with Indigenous communities. And that work needs to continue, but we need to bring democracy to the importance of cultural revitalization for a strong leadership in community development. If we don't have strong cultural leadership with a strong cultural economy, once again, our voices disappear in the fringe of the fringe. So I think cross-sector leadership in the development of infrastructure policy change and contribution to the development of the arts is essential to ensuring the success of economic reconciliation.
What would be your message to federal government?
Put policies in place to stop cultural appropriation. See, in Quebec, we have a wonderful thing called maple syrup. Have you heard of it?
I have.
Yeah, it's fabulous. The maple syrup is part of our heritage of the territory because maple trees don't grow across Canada. They're only in the east. Now, you cannot put Aunt Jemima syrup in a can and call it maple syrup. There's trade laws protecting that because it wouldn't be real maple syrup. We need trade laws protecting Indigenous-made items.
What do you feel about the term reconciliation?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Reconciliation is assuming that you and I had a previous relationship. And a lot of people have never had a relationship with First Nations people. A lot of people have never even sat down with an Indigenous person in their whole life. How can we reconciliate something we never had? I think we should also be raising the idea of conciliation, building relationships. We need to reconciliate with the governments, with the institutions, with the churches, all those infrastructures that have stripped us of our legacies, our land, our cultures. We need to reconciliate. We need to make it right. You see, we speak of economic reconciliation, but right now, the one that has the main voice in Canada is the multinational, the ones that are exploiting the land. They're taking the resources from the land. It's bringing wealth to the community, But if you have wealth coming in, but no self-esteem for who you are, or pride for your cultural heritage, what is that wealth good for? Culture is the narrative core in building stronger communities. If you have people in an Indigenous community that has been uprooted for over 200 years, you need to rebuild that.
Nadine, thank you very much for joining Raw Talks.
Thank you so much for having me.